Welcome to CMJ's Culture Shift webinar, Security and Privacy for Activists. I'm Kayyali Communications Organizer for the Center for Media Justice, home of the Media Action Grassroots Network, also known as Magnet. As a communications organizer, I lead our storytelling approach and support for our members and their stories. Culture Shift webinars are interactive webinars where we work with movement leaders to provide great educational opportunities for you, our community of supporters, and our members. We do this to teach about critical media issues, connect with leaders in the field, and find out how to take action at the local and national level. We are so glad you all have joined this training today. Today we are here with an amazing trainer, Dia. Dia is an activist, writer, and attorney. Most recently, they were an activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They focus on street-level surveillance technology, such as IMSI catchers and drones, U.S. national security policy, privacy, anonymity, and freedom of expression. Dia has worked on EFF's street-level surveillance and surveillance self-defense project, advocacy for anonymity and privacy with government bodies and companies, and has coordinated a variety of U.S. campaigns to limit surveillance at the national and local level. As a Syrian American, Dia got especially interested in surveillance because of the experiences of Arab and Muslim Americans after 9/11. In today's training, Dia will give us an introduction to assessing our digital risk and needs, as well as provide tools we can use to protect ourselves. Before we begin, I'd like to share some logistics about the webinar. If you're on Twitter, please join us for a parallel conversation using the hashtags MediaJustice. We will hear from our trainer today and then open up the call for any questions. While the presenter is talking, you will be on mute, but please feel free to send any questions either in the chat section on your panel, or you can email them to Shiloh, S-H-I-L-O, at mediajustice.org. So now we'll begin. Here, Dia.
Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here today to talk about security and privacy with all of you. Shaneri did a great job of introducing me. Just a little bit more about my background in terms of activism and movement work. Before I started doing security and privacy work, I was very active doing legal support for demonstrations with the National Lawyers Guild. So that's where some of my interest in this comes out of as well. Personal interest and having that sort of background around, especially around organizing for street actions and things like that. So I just want to say the reason I'm using a harm reduction framework here for this workshop is that I think a lot of times when people hear security and privacy, it feels a little bit overwhelming, like you have to do everything right. So that's why I like to use the harm reduction framework. It's impossible to have perfect security and privacy, but I'm just going to talk today about how you can improve your security and make yourself a little bit safer. So of course, this is not legal advice. A lot of this is my opinions, and a lot of this is pretty subjective, as you're going to see as we go forward with the presentation. So the first thing and the most important thing that I'm going to talk about is risk assessment. Risk assessment is looking at your personal situation, and of course not just for you, but for you and those you care about and organize with, and thinking about what your personal risk is, because it's very different for everybody. It's different for every individual, and it's different for every group. And of course, the individuals that are part of a group are going to affect the risk for that whole group. So risk assessment is 6 questions that you ask yourself, and we're going to go through each one of these. What do you want to protect? Who do you want to protect it from? 2 questions that are basically one, how likely is it that you'll need to protect it? And the questions that you're going to ask there are how motivated are your adversaries, and what sort of skills or technology do they have at their disposal? How bad are the consequences if you fail to protect yourself or others, and how much trouble are you willing to go to prevent those consequences? So first time I heard that, it felt like a lot, but as you'll see, these questions make a lot of sense. And I guess just side note, a lot of times when I'm doing these presentations, it's sort of in person, so I'll get people to jump in to chime in. Since all of you can't jump in yet, I'm just going to say what some of these things are that we're thinking about. So what do you want to protect? What sorts of things are you thinking of? Organizing strategies, of course. What are your plans? You might want to protect your legal name if you're doing something on Twitter or sharing information on Twitter. Biometric data, this is a big one, especially again if you're doing actions in the street. So something to think about, how law enforcement might use this information. Your movements, so this comes into play when you're thinking about your cell phone, of course, cell phone tracking, but also your car, for instance, and the sort of tracking of movements of your car that could happen. Then a lot of your online activities or information that might be online, so credit card information, financial information, content of emails and chats, passwords, your files that you would have on your computer, and then just information about who you are and who you know. So identities of people you're in contact with, the contacts in your address book, and things like that. And I know on this list it says phone calls, chats, emails. So it's the content of those things, but it's also even just who you're talking about. Some of you may have heard a lot about the bulk phone records collection that the NSA was doing. They were able to get a lot just from who you call, how long you talk to them, whether the call was completed. So the reason I have this slide here is I just want to remind folks that the question isn't just what you want to protect, like what sorts of information, it's sometimes who do you want to protect. Maybe you're organizing with folks that might be more vulnerable than you. Maybe you're doing work that is directly working with really vulnerable populations. Whatever it is, sometimes you want to think about who you want to protect. And we definitely, in general, want to think of security as a community issue. So who are your potential adversaries? I put local cops top here. I was sort of thinking of these in terms of what the danger might be for folks who are doing organizing. I think all of these are important. So local law enforcement, when they're on duty, cops and others who organize nationally to harass activists when they're off duty as well. Prosecution in criminal cases, the feds, NSA, FBI, and actually I should have included on here because it does matter for some folks, the IRS even, definitely ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So government parties are a lot of times what comes first to people, but there's also lots of other folks you might want to think about. The media, I think, again, for all of you, this is probably something that folks have already thought about. But also, people you might not want to know all about your organizing. So if you have a day job, right, you might not want your boss to know. Targets of actions, of course, that's a big one. School and campus, that's sort of similar. Twofold, maybe you don't want everybody at your school or campus administration to know about an action you're planning. They might actually be the target of the action. So this is just, again, the beginning of a list. Think about this for yourself, both in terms of organizing actions or other organizing work, but also in general for you and what your particular risk is. And actually, just to back up a second, I'll say, I'll give you an example. For me, of course, when I'm doing legal support, I'm very concerned about information about people who've been arrested and our strategies for providing legal support to them. What makes it a little different for me is being Syrian American, I have all of that sort of surveillance to think about and plan into my risk assessment. So I'm thinking about myself individually, I'm thinking about the organizing as well. No. And just got another one popping up there. Definitely want to be thinking about corporations and social media platforms. You should assume that most companies are going to be happy to turn over your information, and also just for personal reasons, you might not want them to have your information. Okay, so the next question you're going to ask is, how likely is it that you're going to need to protect your information or any of those things that we talked about? And these two questions, how motivated are your adversaries and what are their capabilities, go hand in hand. So for instance, local law enforcement would probably love to know if you're planning an action in the street targeting the police department. They would love to know the contents probably of every phone call that you're having. They might not have that capability, whereas a federal agency might have it. So they might be incredibly motivated, but they might just not have a lot of skills or a lot of technology, or they might have a lot of technology and be less motivated. However, that being said, I think for this work, for organizing in this political moment, how likely is it that you will need to protect information about organizing? It's pretty likely. These are just a few headlines about the sorts of surveillance that we've been seeing. And we know that there's a lot more. We know that social media is a big target, not just for local law enforcement, but also for the FBI. We know that the FBI and local law enforcement is sharing information. So it's pretty likely that you're going to need to protect yourself, protect your information, and protect your organizing. How bad are the consequences? Again, this is another factor that you want to weigh. These are some of the consequences that I could think of. I'm sure there's more. Just going back a little bit to the potential adversaries, I just wanted to emphasize again that school administration and campus administration definitely a potential adversary, and while I didn't pull up any specific headlines about that, we know that they have absolutely been complicit in working with law enforcement to try to stop organizing and stop actions. So how bad are the consequences? Again, these are just some potential consequences. Organizing strategies revealed and countered is a huge one. Private data made public, so that can be about the strategies. It can be the media, sharing that they found out about an action that's going to happen. Offline harassment. This is, some folks have experienced after they've done organizing, getting really scary text messages or phone calls from what's probably off-duty law enforcement that, as I mentioned, has been organizing to harass people. People's phone numbers or email addresses or home addresses could be posted online. That's what's known as doxing. Financial losses, you could be fired. Some folks have been fired or had other consequences for doing organizing outside of work. Jail, of course, is a big one when we're thinking about street actions, government harassment. One that I didn't include on here is, getting expelled from school. If you're a student or working with student organizers, that's definitely something that has happened. Or the other disciplinary proceedings, doing legal support. This is a huge thing that we've dealt with in the Bay Area even. Another one that I did not include on there is for folks who are not documented. Organizing, if you fail to protect your information, can lead to problems with if you're going to apply for citizenship. It can lead to, of course, deportation, detention, all of those consequences as well. So this is the big question. Once you've gone through all of those things for yourself and for folks that you're working with, you have to ask yourself, how much trouble are you willing to go to prevent those consequences? So this is a balancing act for everybody. And I just wanted to say on here, not everybody needs to learn how to use encrypted email right now. A lot of people in the security, privacy, internet freedom world might be mad to see me put that on a slide, but I think it's really important to say, you know, when people hear security and privacy, they, I think, oftentimes think of really technological tools that might be difficult to use. If the tools are difficult to use, they're not going to be helpful anyway because you're not going to use them, which I wish everybody in my world on this end of things would think about. You know, encrypted email might not be the most important thing for you. So it's really about specifically what kind of organizing you're doing, what are your vulnerabilities, what are the potential consequences. So I did just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what encryption is. Everybody uses encryption every day. You know, if you're logging into Facebook, that's encryption. But basically, encryption is a process that takes information and makes it unreadable except for a person who knows how to decrypt it. Usually, going back to the Facebook example, you know, you type in your email address, you type in your password, that is sent encrypted over the internet. When it gets to Facebook, Facebook knows how to read it. So you use encryption every day, but some of us use more encryption than others. So for example, some folks might have encryption turned on their phone, where with an Android, you actually have to specifically turn it on. That means that all the data on your phone would be encrypted, except for you when you type in your password. So encryption is incredibly important because it could save you from jail, it could save your organizing, or it could even save your life. And I just wanted to say here, you know, really to put this in context, the government is trying very hard to undermine encryption right now. And Center for Media Justice and Malkia have done a really good job of talking about why this matters for organizing, why it matters for the Black community, and really just why it matters. It's not a hypothetical issue of privacy. It's about do you have the right to have something that the government can't see? You know, and traditionally we think yes, right? You have the right to have curtains on your windows. You should have the right to have your text messages encrypted, to have your phone encrypted, to have your laptop encrypted, so that the government can't see what's on there. So I know I went through the risk assessment really quickly, and I should say we are gonna definitely have time for questions, and I'm really looking forward to questions. If things are coming up as I am going through this, you can absolutely just put in those questions now, and I'm going to look at everything that's coming up. I did just want to touch on a few basic things that I like to talk about for everybody. Once you've done the risk assessment, more specific tools are probably going to come up for you. But some things that everybody should be doing, passwords, most important thing. That I think everybody needs to take care of their passwords. Most of us are not using secure passwords. Most of us are reusing passwords. So the most important thing is put a password on anything that can have a password. So your phone should absolutely have a password on it. Your laptop should have a password on it. And this will really matter, you know, if you get arrested and police take your laptop, take your phone, it will matter legally if there's a password on it. So put a password on it. A strong password is unique, long, and randomized in some way. And randomized means, you know, you had no connection with the words they didn't come out of your head. The way that I usually tell folks to make a password is either using a password safe. So this is something like LastPass, OnePass, KeePassX. This is a password manager that will hold all of your passwords. It has a very long, strong master password that you type in, and then you have all of your passwords in one place. When it's closed, they are stored in an encrypted database on your computer, on your device. Those also have password generators on them, so you just give it a few specs like use uppercase letters, use lowercase letters, whatever, hit generate password. So you can do it that way. You can do it using Diceware, and I can send that website to folks. I didn't realize I didn't put the link on here. But it's a list of words that you roll dice. Depending on what number you get, you'll pick a word from that list. That's the first word in your password. And a lot of times folks like to use the phrase passphrase instead of password, partly because it's helpful to convey that we're not talking about a single word, right? A strong password is something that's like 6 words long. And then two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is where the best example I can think of that most folks, I think, who use Gmail have this turned on. If you don't, go turn it on after this. So when you go to log into your Gmail address, you put in your password, and then the second factor is a code that you type in, and that will, you can either get that as a phone call. Most people do it as a text message. And I think that's the most common way that two-factor authentication is set up on sites like Gmail, Twitter. So it's where you are getting something else. It's not just your password. And I know for a fact that two-factor authentication has helped folks on Twitter. Prominent activists and organizers I know have had people have gotten their Twitter password, and then they got this text, right, saying, here's your code to type in. Because that person didn't have their phone, the person who had their that even had their password still wasn't able to get into their Twitter account, which is great. We don't want people's Twitter accounts out there spreading false information, campaigns. We want people to have access because we know how important social media is. So that's my spiel on passwords. And I will say all of these specific tools that I'm talking about are, I'm going to put up some resources where you can get more information. This is really just an introduction. So I wanted to say just a little bit about malware and phishing, because I know that, you know, especially when folks get more prominent, when your organizing is effective, you might be the victim of this kind of targeted attack. I also wanted to include it because aside from being activists, this is something that everybody deals with, and so I just want folks to be thinking about this. So phishing attacks, something that looks like just a regular email, you click on the attachment, suddenly your computer is infected with malware. So malware are programs that hide on your computer and can be used remotely to do all sorts of things. So there's malware, for instance, that can actually log your keystrokes, right, and could get all your passwords that way. So just a few tips to avoid malware and phishing. Check URLs closely. Check short links. Short links are a really great way for people to hide something and send you somewhere where you're not expecting to go, but you can check short links. I do that sometimes even on Twitter. Verify emails with people that sent them. So if you get an attachment from somebody, you weren't expecting it, they didn't tell you they were sending something, send them a text message and say, hey, I got this email. Did you mean to send me this attachment? Instead of sending attachments, you can put files on your website or a shared service. If you do get a suspicious document, you can open in an online document reader. So for instance, with Gmail, when you get a PDF, it'll ask you if you want to open it in Google Drive. You can do that instead of downloading it. And then email authentication, signing like PGP, which is encrypted email. We're going to chat a little bit more about that later. Signal. So I wanted to mention Signal because this is a program that I think a lot of folks have started using, and it can be really helpful for activists. So Signal is a program that's available for Android and iPhone, and it encrypts your text messages from the time that you send them to the time that the person they're meant for receives them. It also allows you to make encrypted phone calls over data. So these are not regular phone calls. These aren't regular texts. They're actually, all of this happens over data. So you do have to have a smartphone, and you have to have data available at the time that you're using these programs for them to work. But they're apps. You can get them in the App Store. They're verified. A lot of folks use them. And they allow you, again, to send encrypted text messages and make encrypted calls. A good use case for this is we know, Shineri mentioned in my biography, IMSI catchers. And actually, I'm just going to go forward to this slide quickly, and then I'll go back. So in the lower left corner there of this slide, that's a stingray. Stingray is also known as an IMSI catcher, MC catcher, or a cell site simulator. This technology has a lot of different names, but it's something that can intercept phone calls, intercept text messages. We know that law enforcement is using them at demonstrations. We know that local law enforcement around the country has this technology. The FBI definitely has it. There's even something known as dirt boxes, which are MC catchers on a plane, can be flown over. So the government says that they use this just to get location, right? They track location using these things that trick your cell phone into connecting with them. But we also know that they can capture the contents of communication. So if that's something you're concerned about, if you're using Signal, the only people who can see that text message are you and the person that it's sent to. Your cell phone provider wouldn't even be able to see that. Nobody would be able to see it except for you. What's showing on this screen is a signal call. So what happens when you make a signal call is that you'll get how it says Klaxon Burlington down there. You would read that to the person on the other end, and that's confirming that the encryption is working and that it's actually you and it's actually them. So the quality, I'll say, just disclaimer, quality of signal calls is not always great, especially if your data is not good, but it is definitely more secure than a regular phone call. Another tool that I wanted to mention briefly is off-the-record messaging. And this is a little bit confusing because GChat has an OTR option. And I just want to be clear that if it's not encrypted, off the record for them just means they're not saving the conversation, but they can still read it. So off the record messaging, again, is end-to-end encryption. It means from the time I type something into my computer until it gets to the intended party, if they don't have the keys that we're using to communicate, they can't read it. So if you're using off-the-record messaging with GChat, for instance, how you can do that is route your GChat through a separate chat client. You can use ADM if you're on Mac. You can use Pigeon if you're using Linux or Microsoft Windows. And so these clients will encrypt your message, and the only person who will be able to see it is the person getting it. I like to put this up because it shows what, this is a chat I was having using my Gmail address. So what Google would see, even though it's running through their servers, right? But what Google would see is just all these numbers, all of this encrypted information. I like to talk about off-the-record messaging because all you have to do is install a chat client, set up your email to go through it, which is just put in your email address, put in your password, and it's way easier to set up than encrypted email. And if you're worried about communicating with people who are on the other side of the country, using off-the-record messaging can work pretty well. So again, all these tools that I'm talking about, I'm going to give you some resources to look at when we're done. Definitely, something that you would want to learn about how to install. And there are actually tutorials on this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about street-level surveillance. This is something that I think a lot of times doesn't come up in security and privacy trainings, but it's incredibly important and incredibly dangerous. And frankly, for a lot of folks, it's more of a threat than what's happening online. It just depends on what your situation is. So the things that I have here, if anybody's on here from New York, they probably recognize the upper left corner. That's an NYPD security camera. This picture in the upper right corner is what's known as an automated license plate reader. heavily in use in the Bay Area and around the country, but particularly in the Bay Area, we have some information on how the Oakland Police Department has used automated license plate readers. And surprise, surprise, automated license plate readers are being used the most in the most rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. So Northwest Oakland, if you look at a heat map, automated license plate readers being used everywhere there. So automated license plate readers are, they just take a very quick snapshot of your license plate, and then they'll have the license plate number. They can be, this one is mounted on top of a police car. They can also be stationary. So this is something to think about, right? I mentioned earlier, thinking about your movements. If you're driving your car to a meeting or to a demonstration, if there are automated license plate readers around there, that's one way that your movements can be tracked. I also put in a picture of a clipper card there for folks in the Bay Area. This is, you'll recognize that. But wherever you are, if you're using public transit, you probably have something like this, a reloadable transit card. This is just to remind you to be thinking of all these sorts of things, right? If you are using a reloadable transit card, you're paying for it with your credit card, it's attached to your identity, and that's a very good way to track where you're going. So this is a map. I think it's pretty outdated, but this is a map of surveillance cameras in Oakland. Street level surveillance, there's less tools to deal with it. So I was just talking about chat clients, right? So there's a way that you can avoid that sort of surveillance. You can avoid surveillance of your text messages, things like that. With street level surveillance, it's really hard to avoid. So just a few tips. Educate yourself about street level surveillance where you're planning on doing actions. If you're planning anything in the street, anti-surveillance activists can probably help with that. So as I mentioned, the map on the previous page is from some students who were just researching Oakland cameras. But depending on where you are, there might be folks who are really looking into this. So Chicago, for instance, has the Lucy Parsons Labs, which is a great, really activism-oriented privacy and security folks started this Lucy Parsons Labs. They actually created a primer on Chicago surveillance. So they go through and talk about what they know the Chicago Police Department is using, which unfortunately, sorry for folks in Chicago, it's a lot. Chicago Police Department loves your toys. So just educate yourself, just so that you know and can be prepared. Phones are really important, again, for street level stuff. So maybe don't bring your phone. Get a burner phone, so a prepaid cell phone. Just to use for street actions, or maybe think about having specific people who are going to have bring the phones, like just to do social media, for instance. Like, I hate it when people just say don't bring your phone to the demonstration when we know that a lot of the reason why you're going to the demonstration is you're going to tweet about it, you're going to take pictures. But there are ways around that. Maybe just have specific people doing that. As I mentioned, think about how you're getting to an action. Cars in public transit are going to equal, and this is actually in general, just when you're moving around, not just for something that you've organized on the street, but think about how you're getting places, and just think about the trade-off there. Whenever possible, you can avoid, like I love to ride my bike to actions or to meetings when I can. It's not always possible, obviously, but that's just one thing to think about. And then, as I said, think about using encrypted texting and phone calls. I just wanted to go back to the signal slide for a second. This is where that balancing the difficulty of using a tool against the consequences of not using it really comes into play, because anybody who's used Signal will tell you it works great a lot of the time, and sometimes it just has those days, and it usually has to do with the data connection where you don't get the texts, or they come all at once. Suddenly you have like 10 new messages. So it's not always 100% reliable, and I just want to be clear about that. That's the big caveat. That being said, it's a big protection depending on what your risk is. So you're balancing that. That goes into the balancing act for you. Is okay, this tool doesn't always work perfectly. So I mentioned I was going to tell you about some resources, and once we get to the Q&A, I can actually, if it would be helpful, I could maybe pull these up so that we can navigate around them a little bit. But surveillance self-defense from Electronic Frontier Foundation is a huge one. So at ssd.eff.org, you will find tutorials for all of the things that I just mentioned. So they have tutorials for specific tools, but they also have more about the risk assessment that we just did. And I should say that a lot of times when people are talking about that risk assessment, they use the phrase threat modeling. The reason I don't use that phrase is because it's, sounds very militaristic. That's actually where it comes from. And I think it just sounds, it's a little confusing to me at least. But that's what they will have, that information under those questions would be threat modeling. Also, all of the stuff I said about passwords, all of that is available on surveillance self-defense. So there's an index where you can just search something specific if you want. They also have a glossary of security-related terms that I find helpful. So in addition to SSD, there's also Security in a Box from Tactical Tech. This is similar. It's a lot of step-by-step tutorials on how to use specific tools. And sometimes I find if I'm trying to figure out how to do something, I'll look at the tutorials from both of them. Hackerspaces and crypto parties, wherever you are, you're probably going to have these resources available, or if you're in a larger city. There might be free classes or workshops, and there might be crypto parties. So crypto parties are skill shares for using the kind of tools that we've been talking about. There's some really great crypto parties out there. I know that in New York, there's Harlem Crypto Party. Here in the Bay Area, LawSpace, which is a hackerspace in Oakland that is people of color and women-led, has a Monday night just open event that anybody can come, ask questions, talk about these tools, really whatever you want. So, finding, I think it's really helpful, if you want to use one of these tools, go check out the tutorial, see if you can figure out how to install it. If you can't get help right away, see if you can figure it out. But once you've tried using something, you're definitely going to end up having more questions. So as much as you can, getting in-person help, I think, is really useful. Okay, so I know I ran through that quickly, partly because I want to have a lot of time for questions, and I'm seeing the questions that have already come up, so I'm going to take a look at those. Okay. Okay. So I'm happy to share. One of the questions was, will participants get a copy of the presentation? Will there be a recording? Yeah. Yes. So there will be a recording. I'm also happy to share my slides, and the slides that I made, not copyrighted. Feel free to do whatever you want with them. I would be overjoyed if anybody who's on this webinar eventually ends up doing one of these trainings themselves. So please feel free to do whatever you want with them. I see there's a question, is there a place in the Bay Area where I can get help? So yeah, in the Bay Area, LawSpace, it's Liberating Ourselves Locally. It's in San Antonio, Fruitvale area. If you just look up LawSpace, you'll be able to find it. And as I mentioned, there is a Monday night event that happens, and there specifically are folks at the Monday night event who are there to answer questions about security and privacy. So it's a skill share, but also specifically if you have questions. In addition to LawSpace, there are a bunch of other hackerspaces in the Bay Area. There's also Pseudo Room, which is in North Oakland, and Noisebridge, which is in the city. I would recommend checking out Law Space first. There's a lot of folks there that do organizing and activism. And I think it's a really great place. I see there's a question about Los Angeles. I don't know off the top of my head, but I am happy to share my email address with any of the participants, and I apologize, I think it was just on the first slide, so let me go back to that and give everybody a chance to write that down. So any of the questions that I can't answer, I'm more than happy to have people email me. So for Los Angeles, I know some really great anti-surveillance activists. I don't know of specific hacker spaces that they have relationships with, and I will check on that, and I'm happy to get back to folks. In terms of activists, you know, Stop LAPD Spying, amazing group of people. They're doing really good work. They've done a lot of work on the Los Angeles Police Department's use of suspicious activity reporting. So in terms of knowing what surveillance is happening in LA, they're a really good group to connect with. In terms of getting help with tools specifically, that I will have to look into. Okay. So there's a question about riseup.org and riseup email. For people who are not familiar, riseup.org is a collective that provides email. They also provide a virtual private network service. They provide Etherpads, which are these one-time shareable documents, kind of like Google Docs, but not as sophisticated. So I feel pretty good about RiseUp. You know, saying how secure something is, you know, you can never really say, but RiseUp, you can route it through Thunderbird, and then you can use encrypted email if you want. A lot of people I know do that. So in terms of my opinion on it, I'll just say that a lot of people who are very security and privacy concerned use RiseUp and route their email through Thunderbird and encrypt their email that way. So I think it's a good option. I definitely, RiseUp maintains their own servers. They have, it's one of those things where, you know, if you're using a RiseUp email address, that's noticeable because there are fewer, but you can know that RiseUp as an organization will do their best to protect your data.
So for those of you who came a little later, we are in our question and answer section. I just wanted to give the email again. So if you have a question, please feel free to chat it in the control panel, or you can send your questions to Shiloh, SHILO, at mediajustice.org. Again, that's SHILO at mediajustice.org. Okay, so I'm going to hand it back to Dia. We have a couple more questions here.
So there's a specific question about TunnelBear. I can't answer that one. I haven't used TunnelBear and don't know anything about that software. So there's a question about, are there any resources that you would recommend for international actions or for activists based abroad? So if there, I'll give you a couple of things off the top of my head, but if you have specific things you're concerned about, please expand on that. So I will say that for international activists, one of the problems that people face a lot is internet censorship, like not being able to access certain sites, including really big ones like Facebook. So in order to address that, you'll have to circumvent that censorship some way. And this is great. I see that the next question is about Tor, and I was about to say that in order to circumvent that, a lot of people use Tor. So Tor is I'm not going to try to explain it super thoroughly. I'm not a technologist, but Tor essentially routes your request to the internet to see something through lots of people's computers. So, you know, as far as we know, the government The NSA hates Tor. They complained about it in a lot of slides, a lot of things that we saw from the Snowden leaks. And as far as we know, they still have not figured out, if you're using Tor, how to see what, they haven't cracked it. They haven't been able to figure out, okay, this person's, we know they're using Tor, we don't know what they're doing. So in order to use Tor, you could do it in a complicated way, but the easier way and the way that most people do it is you go to the Tor website and you download a Tor browser bundle. So what that does is then when you're using your Tor browser and you have Tor turned on, your connection is getting routed through lots of computers. And this is a way to hide really what you're doing online. Now that doesn't change the fact that, so it's gonna hide where you're going. If you're in a place like Syria, for instance, you can't just access Facebook. If you're using Tor, then you would be able to access Facebook. It doesn't change the fact that, of course, whatever you're sending in an email, it's still going through the servers of Google, for instance, right? So Google can still see the contents of the email, the NSA can still see the contents of the email. So it's not a security tool. It's really more for just privacy of the browsing data. So that's Tor. There are tons of tutorials on how to install the Tor browser. And I think that's the easiest way to do it, and really just follow the settings that they have. If you mess up the settings, it can be very difficult. The two caveats I want to give about Tor: one, be aware that it can significantly slow down your browsing. And a fun thing to do when you're using Tor is go to Google, because Google automatically detects your location. And it'll probably show up that you'll get French Google or whatever, and that's how you can tell where your connection is exiting. So that's one thing. And the other thing, and people ask about this a lot, is is using Tor going to make me more of a target? It could potentially, and that is something to be aware of. The government absolutely pays attention to who's using Tor, and in fact, they were trying to fingerprint the browsers of people who were using Tor, which is a big thing that I will not get into. But just know that is something to be aware of. So in addition, and so Tor is available. You can use Tor on your phone as well. There is a Tor browser for your phone. So in addition to Tor, the other thing I wanted to mention, because somebody asked about Tor and safe browsing. Safe browsing is one of the things that I oftentimes have in my slides. I took out this time was HTTPS everywhere. So HTTPS everywhere is an extension for Chrome and Firefox that forces sites to go to the HTTPS version. So HTTPS is a slightly more secure way to browse the internet. It is transport layer encryption for whatever you're putting into a site. What I mean by transport layer encryption is, let's say you go to Google, and I'm gonna check and see if the HTTP version of Google is even available anymore. Oh, yes, I think it is. Pardon me, I'm typing something on my laptop right now. Well, it might be, but so when you type anything into a regular site, a site that just says HTTP, that is being sent in the open. So for instance, you were on an open wireless network. Somebody with the right software would be able to see that see whatever you had typed into that site as it was being sent to the site. So that's pretty unsafe. And that goes, usually you'll say, okay, I'm typing in my password to something, it should be HTTPS. But anything that you type in, you want to think about the security of that. So if you install HTTPS everywhere, transport layer encryption means that what you type as it's transported over the internet is going to be encrypted. And then when it gets to Google or whatever, if you're at HTTPS, google.com, Google will be able to see it, but somebody in the interim who was able to intercept that request to Google wouldn't be able to read it. So that is that's one of the sort of basic things that you'd want to think about in terms of your privacy when you're browsing. Um, let's see. The person who asked the question about international actions and activists based abroad. So Tor, the stuff about Tor was partly in response to that because I know that censorship and being able to access online resources is a big concern. But if you have any more about that, please feel free to follow up. Oh, and yes, thank you. Somebody said making sure people don't use riseup.org, it's .net. That's correct. Um, okay, so there's a question about, can you talk to us more about surveillance as a tool for political oppression? Do you see surveillance becoming stronger and more powerful? Absolutely. So one of the big things that I focus on that makes my work a little bit different from a lot of people in the sort of internet freedom, privacy, security world is the street level surveillance. And as I said, there are all of these tools that people have gotten grants for and gotten funding to work on things like the Tor project, right? To work on Signal. Open Whisker Systems are the folks who have created Signal. So these are great tools, but they're not super helpful when you're out on the street. And I think part of that is because the folks that are going to be most affected by street level surveillance are also probably the folks who are not like the objects of these grants, right? So to put it more bluntly, like it is people of color and other marginalized folks who are going to be most affected by street level surveillance, and there's been less funding to address that. And it is becoming more powerful and stronger every day. And you just have to look at activism around the country against the kind of technology that law enforcement is getting to see that it really feels like, I hate using the phrase whack-a-mole because it's kind of like whack, but that is how it feels. Oakland and the Bay Area, where I've done most of my work on that level, is a perfect example. It's like a couple of years ago, the Alameda County Sheriff wanted to get a drone. Tons of people showed up. People sat in line for hours to testify against the drone. He ended up not getting it. Eventually, he just went and bought one with his own money. Right, the board of supervisors didn't approve it, even though people had shown up and had bought. So law enforcement around the country is always getting new toys. They are getting encouraged to get those toys by federal money. So there's a lot of federal money that is being filtered down, these Homeland Security grants. And just all the time, yeah, surveillance is at the street level and online is getting more powerful. So surveillance is a tool for political oppression. A big part of the reason why I like to frame this work as harm reduction and not as like, okay, everybody's going to have perfect security and privacy now, is that the government knows that you're being watched, and they want you to feel overwhelmed. They want you to feel scared. They want you to not communicate with each other. And I think we've all seen it. This is where I feel funny that I can't see all of you because like I would ask for a show of hands, but like I'm sure that many of the folks who are with me right now have had somebody say to them, I think like, well, I don't want to talk about that on the phone, or I don't want to say that in an email, or I don't trust that person. I think they might be an informant, right? Because we've been talking about technology, but it's all tied together. So the in-person surveillance is tied to technology. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about chilling effects, right? Like people are scared to meet, people are scared to talk. And the other thing that I've seen, and this is just very particularly in my role of doing these kind of trainings and sharing this kind of information, is that people really start to second guess themselves and to second guess things that might be every day. Like people can't access Twitter and they're like, oh my God, like the government has some device that they're using right now to stop us from accessing this site. That might not be what's going on. It might be that there are 100 people all trying to tweet at one time. It could be what's going on, but like it's the mystique around this technology, I think, that really makes it more powerful, um, because it's scary. Um, so let's see. So maybe, since we not seeing more questions, um, oh, okay, great. Looks like the person who was asking about resources for international actions. Thank you. Looks like you're following up. Okay. So the question more specifically was about tools for secure communication. Um, so particularly in the Middle East and East Africa, this is a situation where, the consequences are very deadly for folks. They're immediately deadly, or they can be. And that is a situation, like this is why you want to do the risk assessment. That is a situation where, depending on what you're talking about, you might want to use encrypted email, right? Like, if the contents of an email could land somebody in a jail where they might not leave, that's a time when, depending on who's doing the organizing and what access, what resources you have, you might want to think about learning how to do encrypted email. So the other thing is knowing, when you can, knowing what sort of relationship the provider of a tool has with the government in a specific country. So really chilling example is WeChat. A lot of folks, a lot of Tibetans use WeChat. WeChat is totally complicit with the Chinese government. People have been entrapped with WeChat messages. There's this great organization that put out a YouTube video to educate people about it. You might not know that right away, though, right? So that's just something to think about. Like, what sort of relationship is there? Twitter and Facebook are another example of like different relationships. Twitter used to push back much harder against government requests to take content down than they do now. So that's just one thing to think about in terms of tools for secure communication. So I would say that's another place. So in addition to encrypted email, and there was a question specifically about WhatsApp. WhatsApp encryption is definitely, like, using WhatsApp definitely better than just sending a regular SMS. I can't speak to how strong their encryption is, but they are getting pushback from the U.S. government, which I think is a good sign. And really any level of encryption, like it's sort of, it's not black and white, it's shades of gray here. So any level of encryption is better than no encryption. But yeah, so in addition to the encrypted email and WhatsApp, this is a situation where off-the-record chat could be really helpful for activists. So it allows people to communicate instantly, but at the most secure level that we can currently provide, which is end-to-end encryption. There are times when you really just should not say anything online if you're not going to be using that kind of security. So again, that's like, if anybody who's already using GChat, if they install one of those clients that I mentioned, Adium or Pigeon, they can set it up to be doing this off-the-record instant messaging. So another one of the things I wanted to mention is about SSD, surveillance self-defense. There are actually playlists on surveillance self-defense. So playlists are just lists of the tools that the folks who put together that guide thought would be most useful for specific people. And there's an international human rights defender playlist. So I would strongly advise taking a look at that. to think about more tools that might be helpful. Yeah, so this question, can you talk a little more about keeping Facebook communication safer? Yeah, so, and I guess just a background word about social media, you know, especially for organizers, social media is such a catch-22. It's like I think especially in the last few years, right, like doing this work without, for instance, making a Facebook event. Like if you're doing a demonstration, you want to have a Facebook event, probably how most people are going to find out about it, and that's definitely how the police are going to find out about it. And we all know that. So action really, really comes in. Okay, so you know, you post the event on Facebook. If you're doing any sort of direct action, you know, you have to work really closely with the people that you're doing that with to say, like, no word of this, and here's the ways that we could maybe accidentally write about this on Facebook. Because I know that's happened at times. It's like you have an action plan, and that piece of it is not supposed to be public, and it becomes public by accident. So part of it is having an agreement, especially with core organizers, about what is and isn't okay to share on Facebook. A surprising thing to know is that you can actually route your messenger through record thing that I was talking about. So that's one thing. I think that it's you should that any information that Facebook has is available to the government. And you know, so folks know, like if you post something and then you delete it, Facebook is still going to have access to that. I think it is really important to be clear about who you're friends with on Facebook. Definitely, there's another guide on surveillance self-defense that I think is really helpful about social media. So go through, lock down all your settings. Even once you've done that, be clear that anybody can take a screenshot, right? And people do all the time. But that being said, you know, have specific settings, privacy settings for who you want to have. So I guess I was cutting out a little bit. So just to reiterate, you can route your Facebook messages through the end-to-end encrypted chat clients that I was talking about. So even if you're still using Facebook to communicate, that way all that Facebook would have on their servers is the instant messages looking like that. So really, who cares if Facebook turns that over to the government? So that's just for Facebook messaging. And then, yeah, just going through your social media and getting it on lockdown is a really good idea. And just being clear about that, doing. Okay, so looks like there are not more questions. Again, I know that I went through, you know, really what we went through here for the most part was the risk assessment. And the reason I did that is because this is the most important thing, because I really want all of you to be focusing on the tools that you really, really need. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. So go through the risk assessment individually. If you're part of an organization, part of an affinity group, part of a group of folks that's planning an action, go through those questions for your group. And then you can move on to the specific tools. And even if after today you don't pick up a single new tool, a lot of this is habits, right? A lot of it is the passwords. It's just thinking about these things, thinking about how can I get the information about what the risk actually is. And so that's a win for everybody, even if you're not picking up any new tools. If you change those habits, change those passwords, set up two-factor authentication, you've already improved your privacy and security. So I am going to pass it to Shinyeri, and I just want to plug again, please absolutely feel free to email me, even if it's questions about a specific tool and how to install it. I might not be able to help you, but I can hopefully find somebody who can.
Thanks everyone for joining us today, again for today's webinar. Thank you so much, Dia, for providing just a wealth of information and insight. It's really critical that we work together to ensure our safety and our security. To be able to do that, CMJ is rolling out a bunch of meetings across the country around surveillance and their impact on communities of color.